All right, so today we will talk about statistical inference in distributed and constrained settings. I'll try to give some techniques and recipes, and let's see how it goes. So what's on the menu today? We will have some appetizers starting with a motivation, and then there'll be two main courses. And finally, do-it-yourself desserts, which will be shepherded by Clement. And meet your chefs. So I'm Jayadev, and we have Clement from Australia and Himanshu, who just woke up in beautiful Bangalore. So in terms of appetizers, we'll talk about what is basic statistical inference and what are these distributed or constrained settings we are talking about. Then I'll give some problems and examples and related work and pointers. Okay. The first main course will be on estimating discrete distributions. We'll talk about a very simple looking puzzle, and that puzzle will be the key to solving a lot of actually technically solving all problems in under communication constraints for discrete distributions. Then I'll talk about lower bounds for interactive estimation. I'll describe what interactive estimation means in a little bit. And we'll see that as an application, we can get tight bounds for communication constraints, for privacy constraints, and so on. Okay. In the second main course, Himanshu will talk about a more unified method for, again, for these problems, which will cover both discrete, high-dimensional, non-parametric, and also non-parametric distributions. And communication and privacy will be some of the constraints, and we'll try to develop general plug and play methods, which you should be able to apply to a couple of problems or a couple of typical examples in the recitation section. Okay, so that's the basic outline of the entire tutorial. All right. And again, if there are questions, please feel free to either unmute and ask or just put it in the chat. I think Clement is watching it like a hawk. Okay, so what is statistical inference? We consider this very simple and clean setup where you have a family of distributions denoted by script P, which is over some alphabet X. And this bold P is an element of this calligraphic P, so it's a distribution. And you get n IID samples from this distribution P that you don't know. And the goal is, after looking at these NIID samples, you want to solve some kind of inference task over P. Okay, you want to know something about P. You may ask, okay, what is P? Is P a uniform distribution or anything else that you may want? And in this talk, the metric that we will consider as how good our approach is by sample complexity, which I'll define soon, which is the smallest n to solve the task. So I give you some problem, and then you say, okay, what is the number of data points that I need to see to solve the problem? Okay. All right. So this is inference in the central setting where you get access to X1 through Xn. You have clean access to clean samples. Okay, but as the title of the talk suggests, we have distributed or constrained settings. So what does it mean? It means we don't have direct access to all the data samples at one place, and we cannot perform computations over all of them at the same time. Okay. Why? Because as this slide says, the motivation is, you can see all of these devices that are everywhere, and maybe the data is being collected across a large set of population, which due to various constraints doesn't want to send the data, cannot send the data, or maybe even if it sends, it's only through a partial access that you can get to it. Okay. So for example, here I have just listed a bunch of reasons why you may not have access to clean data. For example, the top thing denotes privacy, where people don't want to share their data. The bottom thing is communication constraints, where people, even if they want, the data size is so big that they can't send samples. Then this funny looking picture on the right bottom is maybe there is an adversary that controls a fraction of the data samples and corrupts it in a way that you just don't get pure samples anymore. Okay. So with that in mind, one formulation that we will consider is instead of getting access to these x1 through xn, which are still the samples generated according to P, you get access to y1 through yn, which are the messages that are sent about these xi's. And your goal again is, after looking at these y1 through yn, to solve the same task that you wanted to solve before. But now you don't get the pure samples anymore. Okay. So now let's see, how do we model these constraints? Okay. So the setting we will look at is the following. You have n users as before. So now think of these x1 through xn, the n samples, as being distributed across n players, across n users. This is the user data maybe. And user T observes xt, which is the pure sample according to distribution P. And it sends a message yt. So how can we model this? We can model it through a channel script W. Okay. So what do we mean by this? The process of converting a sample xt to a message yt will be captured in this map. Okay. So wt will denote the mapping from xt to yt. Okay. It's pretty vague, but I think in a couple of slides, this should become very clear. So we'll denote this wt of y given x as the probability that you will see message y when the input is xt. So if you observe x, what's the probability that the output message is y? So that's a conditional probability or a randomized mapping. And what will happen is, the way the constraints will be captured is through this script W, which will be a set of allowed channels. And that's what will capture the constraints. Okay. And what the algorithm will do is to choose the best possible channels from the script W. Okay. So the algorithm is going to dictate how WTs are chosen. Okay, let me give a couple of examples, and then we will go back to a little more detail. Okay, so one thing to observe is, once I fix this channel W2, once I fix the mapping of how I'm going to convert the samples into messages at the player T, I know the output distribution of YT when the input distribution is from P. Why? Because you can just write what's the probability that YT is Y. I just sum over all possible input symbols X times the transition probability of X going to Y. Okay, which can also be written as just expected value of WT of Y given X when this capital X is sampled according to P. Okay. If there are any questions, please feel free to ask, or maybe in a couple of slides when I motivate why we are looking at this particular kind of setting. So the first example of a constraint that we look at is communication constraints, where each player, and we denote this constraint as script W underscore L, where L is the number of bits that each player can send. So each player can send only an L bit message to you. So each message consists of L bits. And therefore, if you consider the script WL, which is the set of all channels that maps the input set X to L bit strings. Okay, so each xt is mapped to L bits, and that captures bandwidth constraints. That's it. And now if each player chooses one channel from this set script WL, you have a communication constraint framework. Okay. And the second constraint we can look at as a typical example is a local differential privacy, which is defined by this this expression. Okay, it's I think once you start using it, it will seem pretty natural, but I don't know, it took me maybe a month to just understand what it's saying. Okay, so what this is saying is, you take any two possible inputs to the channel X and X prime, and you fix any output Y. It says that the probability of observing Y given X divided by Y given X prime is upper bounded by something. What does it mean? It means that if you see symbol Y, you won't have a very good idea about whether the input was X or X prime. And that is what local differential privacy is. It basically tells you that looking at the output, you may not know the input, and therefore you are preserving the privacy of the input symbol. Okay. And for a given value of rho, this script W rho denotes the set of all rho locally differentially private channels. And as you can guess, if a row becomes smaller and smaller, the channel is more and more private, the output messages will give you even less information about the inputs. Okay. So now let me pause for a second and ask if there are any questions. So you have an input, maybe I'll show it in a picture. Okay, so, all right. So let me just go in a little more detail on how the protocol is and what's the entire setup of the problem, okay? This picture actually captures most of what we are going to talk about. You have a distribution P, X1 through Xn are IID. Each XT now passes through a WT to get the message YT. And these W1 through Wn are chosen from the script W. Now that is your constraint set, as we saw in the couple of examples. Now looking at Y1 through Yn, you want to solve some inference task. All right. Any questions about the setting?
Janet, there are a couple of questions in the chat. One
I
is
see that you are answering very nicely, so I'm not bothered.
So yeah, the first question was, is P fixed during the whole duration? Yes, P is something that is fixed. It's like the background unknown source of data, and you just assume it's fixed. And the goal is to perform some inference task on P. So it's P is fixed there. The second question is
actually a very good question. Yeah.
The second question is what may or I'll let you do.
What may our choice of WT depend on? Are the observation sequential? This is a fantastic question, and that is what I'm going to talk in the next 2-3 slides. Thank you. This is actually the core of the at least a core of a part of what I'm going to talk about. Okay, so let me make one very small observation. Okay, so once I decide what these W1 through Wn are, once I've fixed what are the channels that each of these messages or players are going to use, the output distribution is fixed. There is nothing more to be done. Once W1 through Wn are fixed, for the input distribution, you know what the output distribution is going to be. In fact, because the inputs are independent, the outputs will all be independent. So the whole question boils down to, how do you choose these W1 through Wn? What's the best way to, what is the best possible scheme? And the scheme is essentially choosing these channels. Okay. So let's talk in terms of how much freedom do you have in terms of choosing these channels and try to answer this question that was also asked, which is, are the observations sequential or not, and so on. So the simplest kind of protocol that one can think about is, we call it a simultaneous message passing, which is also called a non-interactive schemes, where all the channels are chosen simultaneously at the same time. And in fact, even if the channels are chosen at the same time, there could be two different settings that can happen. The first is what we call as private coin simultaneous message passing, which means basically there is no extra coordination that happens between the players. So all the WTs are chosen independently of each other. What does that mean? That means the Ys that you observe are also independent because the input X1 through Xn are independent. Okay. So one example could be that I fix W1 through Wn before anything happens. They are fixed and therefore also independent. Okay. And pictorially, it's this. It's the same picture that we had before. So there is no extra thing that controls anything. So W1 through Wn are chosen by the players themselves and are independent of each other. Okay, so that's the first setting. The second, a little more involved setup. And again, this is also a simultaneous message passing, is where all the Ws are chosen simultaneously, but they can actually depend on a random string, which will be the shared randomness or common randomness or public coins or anything else you want to call. So in this setting, what will happen is there's a common string U, which is a random string independent of anything else that's available to all the users and the server. And now each WT is again chosen at the same time as a function of U. So now if you look at the outputs Y1 through Yn, they will be all independent given the common randomness. Let me just show it with a picture. So here what happens is U is generated independently of everything else. And now depending on what U is, W1 through Wn are chosen by the players at the same time. So now the players can synchronize in some sense. And there could be problems. In fact, I'll give a couple of examples where just having shared randomness or having the shared coordination, even though it's a non-interactive scheme, can be very helpful. Okay, so this is the second kind of protocol, simultaneous message passing with public randomness. Okay, now going to sequential protocols or interactive schemes is here. What will happen is the channels can depend on previous messages. So this will have the observations will be sequential. So again, you will have a common random string that's available to all the users and the referee. And at each time, WT will be a function of the shared randomness and all the previous messages. Okay, again, let's look at the same picture. Here you see these green arrows. So these green arrows are going into all the next players. So for example, W1 is chosen just depending, the first player just looks at the shared randomness and chooses its W1. The second player, when choosing W2, actually gets, in addition to you, the shared randomness, also gets access to the previous message Y1. And similarly, the Tth player gets access to you, the shared randomness, and all the previous messages. Okay. All right. Now, in fact, there is an even more complicated class of protocols, which is called as Blackboard protocols. Okay. And this gives me real headache. Okay. Every time I think about it, it's, we have had long discussions. Okay. And just don't tell Himanshu I snooze through some of them. So Blackboard protocols are where each player, this communication itself can happen in multiple rounds. And for example, imagine each player can send, wants to send 10 bits, but it won't do it at the same time. It will send 1 bit, then wait for everyone else to send their 1 bit, and then it will decide to send a second bit. And okay, clearly, this is a very complicated thing. So we will not talk about it. But in terms of power of each of the model, you can just see that, okay, private coins simultaneous message passing is probably weaker than public coins, which is weaker than sequential interactive, which is probably weaker than Blackboard protocols. And each has its pros and cons, both in theory and practice. For example, maybe it's much easier to implement private coins simultaneous message passing protocols, because you may have this, I don't know, tiny sensors which already have the scheme with which they are going to transmit their observations into messages. So it may be just easier to implement on a hardware. And maybe public coins are also maybe a little more complicated. You have to do some coordination, but it's still okay. So, and interactive schemes may suffer from issues like latency. You may have to wait for a long time, okay, because the communication happens in rounds. Okay. Questions about setting? Any questions about how the communication schemes happen? Or was the explanation so good that... Oh, actually, there are a ton of questions. I apologize. I became too happy with myself. Why do we ask for randomness in the choice of WT at all? Are we imagining a minimax setting? That's a good question. Yes. So I think most of the questions that we are going to study will be in a minimax framework, where P is chosen, not adversarially. P is chosen. P could be the worst possible distribution. Okay. So this is actually a very good question. So what randomness does is the following. So we are going to look at the worst distribution, but without randomness, what happens is you choose W1 through Wn, and then nature can choose the P adversarially. Yeah, so that's exactly the answer. This is a great question, Sam. So, but when you do have public randomness, what happens is now for every P, you are going to randomly choose Ws. So that way you can maybe defend against this choice and do a little better. Yes. Are there any computational constraints on the user? We do not have any computational constraints on the user. It can just choose the best possible W, and That's it. At least in this setting, there is no computational constraint.
Just to say something about that, it's also, so there are some computational constraints or like memory constraints you could model in that setting just by allowing some specific kinds of channels. But also, since a big chunk of that tutorial is going to be to prove lower bounds, not having any computational constraints is actually better, because if you prove a lower bound against something that is computationally unbounded, like you just get like that information theoretic lower bound. But like on the other side, the upper bounds we're going to see are actually kind of simple. There are maybe like a couple like implementation details, like how do you do like a uniformly random rotation, all that kind of things for some of that. But basically you can, like the upper bounds are simple and the lower bounds do not assume anything about computation.
Okay. So now that we know the setup, let's talk about the problems themselves. Okay. So there are two broad category of questions that people, and including us, have tried to study in the setting, which is questions of parameter estimation / density estimation, and the other is goodness of fit / hypothesis testing. So testing and learning, two things. Okay. And again, sample complexity will be smallest n to solve the task. So keep that in mind. And now I'm going to give two examples. First one is discrete distributions. Okay. So from here, we can try to pay a little more attention. Okay. So you have P, which is a set of all distributions over a set of size D, which without loss of generality will assume as 1 through D. The goal of learning / estimation is you get to see these observations, which could be the messages, could be exercise, whatever you get to see. Looking at them, your goal is to output a P hat such that in expectation, the TV distance between P hat and P is at most epsilon. Now going back to the question that was asked before, are we assuming a minimax setting? So I should have written here a min over P hat and a max over P. Okay, so, or in other words, such that for all P. So you want to design an estimator such that regardless of what the underlying distribution is, your expected total variation distance is at most epsilon. And it's pretty well known, and we are going to, I have it on one of the slides, okay, the entire derivation for this. The sample complexity is known to grow linearly with T, linear with the support size, and inversely proportional to epsilon square. And as an exercise, you can try to do this for just estimating the bias of a coin. So D will be 2, and you can try to prove 1 over epsilon square. Okay. And what is this TV distance? So this TV distance is defined as follows, which I think it's easiest to just think of it as half times the L1 distance between two distributions. Okay, that's the total variation distance between two distributions P and Q. Okay. And going to the problem of testing, it's the complement of learning. So you have a reference distribution Q, and your goal now is to test whether the unknown underlying distribution P is equal to Q or it's epsilon away from Q. So you want to test, is my underlying distribution Q or far from Q? And that also people now know the sample complexity of this problem is square root D over epsilon square. So you can actually test with much fewer samples in terms of the domain size than learning, which of course should make sense. Okay, I just want to test, I don't want to learn the whole thing. Okay. Example number 2 goes to high dimensional distributions. So one example could be I have a Gaussian distribution with identity covariance and unknown mean. And the first question could be, I want to estimate the mean in L2 square distance up to accuracy epsilon square in expectation. And again, this is a good exercise. You can see that without constraints, the sample complexity is exactly D over epsilon square up to some constant factors. You can just take the samples, average them, output, and do the analysis. Turns out you can have a complementary question of signal detection, where you get these random observations from a D-dimensional Gaussian. You want to know, is the mean of this Gaussian 0 or has a 2 norm at least epsilon? So this is detecting signal versus white noise. And again, you can show that without any constraints, it's the sample complexity is square root D over epsilon square. Okay. And I think in the recitation, we will talk about one other family of distributions, which is slightly easier to to work with than Gaussians, which will be product of Bernoulli's. Okay. Now I'll just talk about the slide where, what are some of the goals in this broad field? You can talk about establishing the sample complexity bounds or rates for different kinds of Ws. Like we talked about communication constraints, we talked about privacy constraints. You could have many other constraints. For example, these Ws could be some kind of linear measurements of from a high dimensional space to a smaller dimensional space, maybe trying to capture compressed sensing, who knows, right? So you can try to model many different kinds of constraints through this in this framework. You can talk about estimation, testing, or maybe other kinds of properties. For example, maybe you want to estimate the entropy of the underlying distribution. Okay, you may want to understand the trade-off between simultaneous message passing versus interactive. You can have discrete distributions, high dimensional distributions, non-parametric, and so on. And as you can guess, there are many research works in every possible combination permutation of these things. Okay. So what I'll do is in the next slide, I'll just mention distribution testing, because I'm not going to, actually this tutorial is not going to focus too much on testing. So if you'll just look at testing discrete distributions, I have a distribution over a set of size D. I want to do the distribution testing problem that I mentioned a couple of slides ago under differential privacy, let's say. So this has been studied by quite a few people in the last year, actually. And there the observation was that if you have public coins, so with shared randomness, the sample complexity is much lower than without shared randomness. And beyond that, having multiple rounds of interaction does not help. And same phenomenon was also observed for communication constraints. And we'll talk about at least the communication in a little more detail. Okay. And there are a couple more links here, which are also for testing for a general set of channels. What you can show is you can actually come up with a set of constraints where you can show that interactive protocols can help you much more beyond what you can do with a single round of non-interactive schemes, even with public randomness. So this last result that I mentioned here is you can come up with a set of channels such that having interaction can help a lot for testing. And similar results have been observed for Gaussian mean testing and so on. So what I'm going to do is, in this tutorial, we are not going to talk about hypothesis testing. There is actually another very nice place where Himanshu talks about how to do testing and what are all the various nuances and how just having a few bits of public randomness can reduce the sample complexity of testing by a lot. It's a beautiful thing, and you can follow the link later. Okay. And what we want to focus today is mostly on establishing lower bounds for learning under interactive protocols. And it turns out that finding the tight bounds is generally much easier under non-interactive schemes. Why? Because as I said before, once you fix U, all the Ys are independent. Okay, so you can perform a single analysis, fixing all the Ws, there is no more complication. And you can see the general discussion in this paper on why it's easier or harder. So now let me give a few pointers to what are the different kinds of schemes that people use to prove these interactive, these kinds of lower bounds. So first is called Ventry's inequality, which is a generalization of Kramer-Rao bound, and this was used very nicely by Barnes, Hahn, and Osgood, and very recently by Szabo and Zaidit. And that gives sort of a very nice information theoretic view, and it gives unified results for various kinds of problems, primarily for L2 loss, although the recent paper has extended it to LP loss. Another widely used method is strong data processing, followed by Aswad's method, which has been used for both communication constraints and privacy constraints. And it naturally, it's again something that generally works for high dimensional distributions, not and doesn't give tight bounds for let's say discrete distributions as such. And then we'll talk about the chi-square contractions plus Aswath method, which will, I'll try to describe again these things in greater detail over the next, I think 25-30 minutes. Okay, so the first two methods, again, I've given a link. You can of course follow these papers, which are in the references, and on the website also you can follow these papers and see. And for like short examples, you can follow the part 2 of this tutorial, where we discuss both Kramer Van Trees inequality and the STPI based bounds. Okay, so now we can take a deep breath. Okay, so in the next two parts, we'll have the two main courses. The first main course is on discrete distributions, where I'll talk about one beautiful puzzle, which will give us upper bounds for all the problems for communication constraints. Then we'll talk about some lower bounds. I'll try to give some ideas, and then Himanshu will present a much grander view about things in the part right after. Okay, so let's go to our first main course. Discrete distributions, as I mentioned before, you observe these y1 through yn. You want to output a p hat such that expected L1 distance is at most epsilon. And I said the sample complexity is d over epsilon square. Now, many of you have seen it. Some of you may not have seen it. For people who have not seen it, the slides are online. You can just follow this page and prove the bound of d over epsilon square. I'm not going to go over it. Okay, it just uses variance of binomial distributions, and that's it. So now the question is this, okay? We want to solve discrete distribution estimation under communication constraints, okay? So let's see, under L-bit communication constraints. So before we move forward, let me ask one question. Suppose L is log D, then what will be the sample complexity? Can someone give a guess? So suppose we have enough communication. Suppose the small l is log D. I can write L equals log D. Oh, it didn't go. Let me click. Yeah. So if L is log D, then there is no constraint, because our input alphabet size is D. Each player can just send what their sample is. So each yi can actually be xi. And then the sample complexity does not change. Yes, perfect. We have two very attentive people. So let me go to the puzzle. What if somehow in this communication constraint setting, what if we can use the messages and try to simulate samples on our own? What do I mean by that? Let's look at a new task. You have communication constraint, L-bit communication constraints. And your goal upon observing these messages is just the following. I want to generate one sample from P. I want to generate one X whose distribution is exactly from P. Okay, that's the entire question. Okay, so why is this interesting? Because of the following result. If you can simulate one sample by using some F, which is a function of D, the alphabet size, and L, the number of bits of communication, then you take any task T whose centralized sample complexity is T of D epsilon. So D is the domain size, epsilon is the accuracy parameter you want to achieve. Then in the distributed setting, you can solve this problem with a blow up of F of DL. So you use F of DL times T of D epsilon samples to just simulate T of D epsilon samples. And once you do that, you can solve the task by using whatever was the method you used to solve the problem in a centralized setting. So let me just ask, this is the exact same question that I asked a minute ago, and I got a few responses. What is F of D comma log D? How many players do you need to simulate one sample? If each player sends log D bits, it's one. The first player just sees its sample and just outputs it. Okay. Now the question would be, what happens for smaller values of L? Okay. So here is the result. Unfortunately, because of lack of time, I can't build any more suspense around it. So I'll just dive into it. So it turns out there is a private coin simultaneous message passing protocol to simulate one sample. Okay, no matter what P is, you don't get access to P. You just get access to this XS, and even those are now communication constrained. You can use D over 2 to the L players to simulate one sample. Okay, and it turns out even if you have interactive protocols, they still won't help. Okay, so now why is this interesting? Okay, this is why. Now you can use the previous results that we had, okay, about, let's say, communication. Now we just use this to come up with a scheme to estimate distributions with D over epsilon square times D over 2 to the L samples. Okay, D over epsilon square was the centralized rate times D over 2 to the L for the simulation. Similarly, you can do testing with square root D over epsilon square, which was the centralized rate, times D over 2 to the L. Okay, let me just go over this protocol for L equal to 1. It's pretty simple, so I'll just go over it. Are there any questions? Okay, let me just make one small remark. For example, if L is equal to 1, then we need D players to simulate just one sample. Okay, where D is the domain size. We need the order D players. Let's see how it works. Okay, so I'll now give the scheme for 1 bit. Okay, so you take 2 D players and you pair them into D groups. And the first 2 players or the first pair tells if their input symbol is 1. The second 2 players will tell if their input symbol is 2, and so on. Pictorially, this is what they do. And this can be fixed beforehand, so there is no uncertainty in the Ws. Okay, so this is actually a deterministic channel. So Y1 and Y2 both tell you if the input X1 is 1 or and X2 is 1, respectively, and so on. So you take 2D players, and this is what they do. Okay, so player number 2i minus 1 and 2i just tell you if their respective inputs is symbol I. Now what do you do? Here is the scheme, or here is the protocol. You are going to output I, which is again one of the domain elements from 1 through D, if the following 2 things happen. Player 2i minus 1 is the only odd player, odd numbered player, not odd player, odd numbered player that sends a 1. And player 2i, the corresponding even numbered player, sends a 0. Okay, so player 2i minus 1 is the only odd person who actually observes I, and that corresponding to I doesn't observe I. Okay, and if no such I is there, you just output failure. Okay, now the result is that conditioned on not outputting failure, your output is distributed exactly according to bold P. I say bold P because there is a typo. Okay, it should have been bold P. Okay, that's it. That's the whole scheme. Are there any questions? So if I go to the previous page, I know, how am I doing in terms of time? Okay, I have about 15 minutes. I think we started at 8:35, right? Okay, good. The other 2 sessions will be shorter than this. I took away the bulk of the time. Okay, so here it will say that if you look at Y1, Y3, and up to YD2D minus 1, only one of them sends 1. And whoever sends 1, their counterpart there sends a 0. Okay, then you are going to output that I. Now, how does it work? So what is the probability that player 2i minus 1 is the only odd player to send a 1? So that will happen when y of 2i minus 1 is a 1, which happens with probability p of I, times the probability 1 minus p of I prime for every other I prime. Okay. Now you see this second term is actually dependent on p of I. If it was not, then you are done, because then you get a distribution that's proportional to p of I. So that's it. So that's why that's the role of the even numbered players. So player number 2i is going to send a 0 with probability 1 minus p of I. So now the probability that both of these happen is p of I times, oh, this condition should not be there. So probability of outputting I is p of I times this second term, which is over all I prime, including I. And therefore it's proportional to P of I. So that's it, it's sort of a rejection sampling. And now you can extend it to L bits and derive the algorithm for D over 2 to the L. Okay. So using this with using about order D players, you are able to come up with a scheme to simulate one sample. Okay. So in terms of using this as a corollary, we can get these two things that I just wrote. Okay. So we look at 1-bit communication constraints. For centralized setting, the sample complexity was D over epsilon square, as I mentioned. Now it blows up by a factor of D, becomes D square. Similarly, for testing from square root D, it becomes D to the power 3 over 2, exactly using this scheme. Now, interestingly, both of these bounds are tight under simultaneous message passing with private coins. So if you do not have access to public coins, both testing and estimation are tight. In other words, if I do not give you shared randomness, the best thing to do for you for testing or for learning is to do simulate and infer. That's why we call it simulate and infer. And without public coins, it's the best. I'll just mention one thing about testing that I had promised earlier. It turns out that if you have again 1-bit communication from each of the players, but you have shared randomness, then this communication complexity for testing can now be reduced from D to the 3 over 2 over epsilon square to D. So a significant reduction of square root D. Okay. And all of these are bound. All of these bounds are tight. If you do not have private coin, if you do not have public coins, you do have to pay a price for at least testing. And with shared randomness, you can reduce the complexity of testing. But we are not talking about testing. For estimation, it turns out that the sample complexity stays the same. It's still D square over epsilon square when you have 1-bit communication. Okay. Any questions? So this is the upper bound for communication constraints under discrete distributions.
Yeah, Jay, there's a question in the chat by Raul.
There is a question in the chat. Let me see.
Actually, there are 2 questions.
There are 2 questions. Okay. This protocol establishes sample complexity upper bound, but is there a concise institution as to why this is also a lower bound? It seems for P not near the simplex boundary, reporting whether or not. This is a good question. So the question is, can you do something? So it seems wasteful to use all of these bits to simulate one sample if you have a distribution that has a low entropy. That's a very good question. And I think for us, since we are looking at the minimax setting where we look at the worst case distributions, generally it will happen around uniform distribution, and that's where you don't really lose much. But that's, I think, a good question. What if you have, if you want to get the bounds in terms of the distribution itself, then also I think that's an interesting question. And is it possible to do this with an adversary where reporting is not always truthful? That's a very good question. So for example, if you want to do simulation with local differential privacy, you can show that it's not possible to simulate a pure sample. But maybe there the question could be, how many players do I need to simulate to give a sample from a distribution that will be close to the true underlying distribution? And maybe then one can use that. Okay, so this question of simulation could be asked with any set of channels. Okay. There's a message from one to everyone. Okay.
Sorry, copy.
Okay. So now let's go back to our setting of trying to establish lower bounds now. Okay. And hopefully here also, the idea would be I'll try to give at least 2 or 3 different components, which hopefully, even if you don't work in this particular field, you will find it helpful maybe in whatever else that you do. Okay. That's how I lure you in. Okay. So for simultaneous message passing protocols, if you just look at discrete distribution estimation, tight lower bounds were established under communication constraints in a couple of works, and then also under local differential privacy. But unfortunately, none of them extend to this, to the more general setting of interactive protocols for discrete distribution estimation. Okay, and I think this was the question about what happens if the observations are sequential. And the reason is you can have very complicated protocols, right? The Ws could be dependent on the previous messages and so on. So the goal of the remainder of my 10-12 minutes that I have, I'll try to see how do we go about proving lower bounds for general statistical inference problems, and in particular for the case of distributed estimation of discrete distributions. That's it. We want to prove that lower bound of d over epsilon square times d over 2 to the L. But I'll talk about a general setting where that will come as a corollary. Okay. So the general recipe here to prove lower bounds would be to design some hard instances, which are pretty natural once you start working on the problems. And then we are going to use what's called as Aswad's method. I'll try to motivate it. And now the idea would be, so what happens with these channels? You are sending some information, it's getting lost. Okay, so you can also think of these as information getting reduced, or if you take two input distributions, then the output distributions will be closer than the input distributions where that's called as data processing, for example. Okay, and so how much does it shrink? Can we capture it in terms of the channels? That's what we'll try to do. But okay. So let's look at the hard instance for discrete distribution. This turns out to be the hard instance for most of the problems. And if you've seen both for learning and testing, this is a good example to know. Okay. So consider a set of 2 to the power d over 2 distributions, which are indexed by this set plus minus 1 to the power d over 2. And what is happening is best described in a picture. Okay. So you have z1, z2 up to z of d over 2. And the first two symbols, the probability of symbol 1 and 2 are dictated by what z1 is. So for example, let's take this example on the picture on the left bottom. If z1 is 1, then symbol 1 has probability 1 plus 2 epsilon over d, and symbol 2 has probability 1 minus 2 epsilon over d. And no matter how many passes I do, this 1 over k should be 1 over d. I apologize, on the y-axis. Okay. Similarly, symbol 3 and 4, because z2 is 1, symbol 3 has probability 1 plus 2 epsilon over d, and symbol 4 has probability 1 minus 2 epsilon over d. But z3 is minus 1, so symbol 5 has probability 1 minus 2 epsilon over d, and symbol 6 has probability 1 plus 2 epsilon over d. Okay, so in other words, this z1, z2 up to z of d over 2, each of them dictates the probabilities of two symbols. Okay, so if you change z1, the probability of two symbols change, symbol 1 and 2. If you change z2, symbols 3 and 4, their probability changes, and so on. And the interesting thing here is that if you take any two distributions from this class, pz and pz prime, their total variation distance is exactly proportional to the Hamming distance between z and z prime. Okay. So the number of coordinates where they differ are exactly the places where you are going to get the L1 distance from. Okay. And the idea is you now can think of this as points in d over 2 dimensions where each of them are independent of each other. And now we'll show that if you can estimate distribution just restricted to this class, then you should also be able to guess the underlying z. Okay, let me show that in a picture. So now what will happen is we are now going to restrict to a simpler problem where we are promised that the underlying distribution is one of these 2 to the d over 2 distributions. So now what we'll do is we are going to pick one of these 2 to the d over 2 points at random. Okay, so we are going to pick a d over 2 dimensional plus minus 1 vector at random, and that's going to be our PZ. That will be the input distribution. And our goal would be to, again, output a p hat, but with the guarantee that it's within this class. Okay. So now the question would be, okay, so if I can estimate this p hat, can I show that I will also be able to estimate the underlying z? Okay, so that's the idea of Aswad's method. So here is one simple exercise that you can do later is you fix any small z, okay? And p hat is any distribution that whose L1 distance from this distribution pz is epsilon over 10, okay? So you have one of these points, and now you take any distribution within an total variation ball of size epsilon over 10, and then from this p hat, try to pick the closest point in total variation distance. Then the claim is that the Hamming distance between z and z star is at most d over 10. So in other words, if you don't go too far in L1 distance, you will not go too far in Hamming distance as well. Okay, just by using the fact that Hamming the total variation distance just adds up across the coordinates. Okay. So now with that in mind, let me just describe the gist of Aswad's method. Okay. So the idea is if you can estimate the distribution PZ when you are picking it at random from these 2 to the d over 2 distributions, then you can also estimate the underlying z to a high accuracy. So to be more precise, I pick z uniformly at random from this plus minus 1 to the d over 2. And if there is an estimator p hat that looks at these messages, which could be anything, if there is any estimator p hat whose total variation distance from the underlying distribution is at most epsilon over 10. Okay, so I'm going to take z at random, then pz is my underlying distribution. So in expectation, if my loss over this entire random process is at most epsilon over 10, then there exists an estimator z hat, which is able to guarantee that in expectation, it can detect 80% of the values of the z's. Okay, so I pick z1 through zd over 2, and I give you samples or messages, whatever, from that distribution. Now, if you can estimate the distribution in total variation distance, you can also guess a bunch of these zi's. That's the idea. And this is again a short proof, and you should try to do it. It's not at all complicated. Okay. So in fact, using that, you can prove a slightly different statement, which says that if this thing holds, in other words, if you can guess a bunch of the coordinates correctly, then so okay, let's say that probability of zi hat, which is your guess, being zi is at least 0.8 times d over 2. So you can guess 80% of the coordinates because there are only d over 2 of them. Then there exists a subset S of these coordinates of size at least d over 6, such that if I is in that set, then probability of zi hat being zi is at least 0.7. Why is that true? Because if this is not true, then the previous thing cannot be true. This is a small exercise showing that if I have if the sum of a bunch of numbers, each within 0 and 1 is 0.8 times d, then at least d over 6 of them must be 0.7. Otherwise, you just don't have enough sum. Okay, so this is where we will try to work from. So now what we'll do is we'll try to come up with a lower bound to prove for which this can happen. Okay, so now we'll try to look at information bound on one coordinate. When can we predict? When can we figure out zi? Okay, can we figure out zi looking at these messages? Because now we are saying, dude, if you are able to estimate the underlying distribution p, you should also be able to estimate the zi's. Now, when can we estimate the zi? Okay, so let's fix one zi and see when can we figure it out. So just in terms of notations, let's denote this pz to the y to the n as the distribution of the messages when the input distribution is pz according to your protocol. So there are a lot of things that I'm hiding under the rug or in plain sight here, the w1 through wn, which are actually functions of your protocol. So I'm not writing them explicitly. This should be pz to the w to the n of y to the n. But let's just write them like this. Okay, so about 4 minutes. We'll see how it goes. Okay. So what's the goal? The goal is to estimate zi. Okay, so which means zi is now +1 or -1. So let's separate this into two classes. So when zi is +1, let's look at the output distributions. if Zi is +1, there is still a lot of uncertainty in the remaining coordinates. There are d over 2 minus 1 remaining coordinates. You are averaging over them. So that let's call that as P plus I. So which is the message distribution when you know that the ith coordinate is +1. Similarly, you have Zi equal to -1, which is called P minus I, which is the message distribution when the ith coordinate of Z is -1. Now the point is, if you can test whether Zi is -1 or +1, if you can predict Zi from y to the n, then the total variation distance between these two messages must be large, which means that we now have to, if we are able to bound the distance between this P plus I and P minus I, we are good. Okay, so that's the idea. So let me just mention this in this slide. So how is the total variation and hypothesis testing related? And this is, I think, basic signal detection theory question, or basic learning theory question 101. So you have two distributions, P1 and P2. You pick one of them at random, output a sample. You have to guess which distribution you picked. And it turns out that your error is always at least half plus half times total variation. So that's how the total variation is related. For us, P1 is P plus I to the y to the n. P2 is P minus I y to the n, because you get to see these messages and you want to detect whether Zi is +1 or -1. So these are the two distributions. And now note that if I is one of the coordinates that you are able to predict with probability at least 0.7, then the total variation distance between P plus I and P minus I must be at least 0.4. Okay. And this will happen for a lot of the coordinates. Now we want to see when will this happen. Okay, so if we just sum this up after squaring, we'll see why we need to square over all the coordinates. We get that the total variation distance across these message distributions, when you change just one coordinate at a time, is linear in D. Okay. Now it turns out that we need to bound this total variation, which is generally hard. So one more ingredient that I think again will be pretty helpful for several of you is to upper bound total variation by something else that can be handled across different coordinates. So which is why we will go into using KL divergence. So here are two definitions. One is of KL divergence. One is chi-square distance between two distributions. And a very famous series of inequalities between them is the following. The first is called Pinsker's inequality, which says the total variation distance squared is at most KL divergence, which is also upper bounded by the chi-square distance between the two distributions. And in fact, for KL divergence, there is something called as chain rule, which basically expands it for distributions across multiple coordinates. Okay, and I have a short proof of KL less than or equal to chi-square here, which you can try to prove yourself. Okay, so why do we go to KL divergence? Because now we can apply Pinsker. By Pinsker, we are going to get this. So the 4 times total variation distance squared between P plus I and P minus I, the total variation between message distributions when you flip the ith coordinate, is now upper bounded by the divergence across the coordinates. Now, if you sum over I across all of these coordinates, it should be at least d over 10. So if you can solve the underlying problem of estimation, then the total KL divergence across these message distributions as you keep flipping one of the coordinates is at least d over 10. Now the problem is that these message distributions are all mixture distributions. As we saw before, this P plus I is sum over a bunch of Z's of PZ to the Y to the N. So this is a mixture distribution, and mixture distributions are terrible to work with. In general, it's hard to handle. And that's why we went into KL divergence. Why? Because there is this beautiful property of convexity for KL divergence, which is again one of the things that you can try to remember for later. So if you have any two distributions, P1, P2, and Q1, Q2, the following holds, which means that KL divergence is basically convex in all the terms. Therefore, instead of handling these mixtures, we can upper bound it with expectation. So we can fix one of the Z's. So this expectation is over Z. So you fix Z and you look at what happens to the divergence when I just change one coordinate of Z. So PZ is, you have the Z that dictates all the D values. You just change one of the coordinates of Z, which changes only 2 symbol probabilities. Okay. And that's it. So now you have changed the problem from mixture to each individual one. And this was, I think, in some sense, the key to several of these things. So now if you sum over these, if you are able to estimate, you should also have the following result to hold true. That in expectation, the divergence across the coordinates should be at least d over 20. Okay. So now what do we do? How do we, instead of bounding it instead of expectation, let's just bound the expectation by the max. Let's look at one coordinate z and see what happens to the divergence. So I fix z. Okay, so I have a fixed under input distribution pz, and I look at the message distribution by flipping one coordinate at a time, and I look at what is the divergence. Okay, and in fact, the original bound is in terms of mutual information for which it holds, and people who know mutual information can see the relation. But if not, try to derive this again from first principles, and I think Himanshu will reinforce your knowledge about mutual information. Okay, so what's happening here? We are fixing one z, and now we are changing one coordinate at a time. So the z becomes z to the plus 1 is you change the probability of the first two symbols, second two symbols, and so on. And now when they pass through the channel, their distances shrink. So now what do? We just look at the divergences that we had before. We apply the chain rule across time. So this pz to the yt over y to the t minus 1 is the distribution of message yt with input pz when you condition on all the previous messages. Okay, and I think Himanshu probably plans to write these things out, so it'll probably be less intimidating in terms of complexity. So okay, so let's fix the previous messages, which also fixes the channel that's used at the next player. Okay, so channel at player t is a function of all the previous messages and the common randomness. So we denote it as w to the y to the t minus 1. And now we want to see how does this divergence grow at the time step t. Okay, so at one time step. So now the idea is this expression. Okay, so what is the message? How is the message distribution between pz and pz to the plus I related? So note that the underlying distribution pz and pz to the plus I differ only on coordinates 2i minus 1 and 2i. They do not, the distributions are identical over the remaining elements. So using that, you can show that the message distributions are related by this expression. Okay, and now actually we are almost done, because now what we can do is we have to bound the KL divergence between these two quantities. So the quantity on the left and this quantity, and we know exactly how much they differ by. So now we just use KL less than or equal to chi square by and apply. So this is just definition of KL less than chi square. And now we apply this fact that these two differences are exactly captured in terms of the channels, in terms of the Ws. So now you note that the right-hand side, there is nothing else. You have this expression in blue, which is just a function of the channels that you have. And that's how these distributions start separating. Okay. So just one side comment here is that if your input, when can you know what's the value of Zi? By knowing whether the input was 2i minus 1 or 2i. When can you know if the input was 2i minus 1 or 2i? That's when this quantity is bigger. When looking at message y, you are able to say whether it's 2i minus 1 or 2i. So that's essentially what this term is capturing. Okay. Okay, so this is just putting everything in one place. So what we said right now is if there is an estimator, then this d over 20 must be at most n times this entire quantity that we bounded. Okay, so now let's just look at some applications. Okay, you take any channel that's L-bit communication constraint, then this holds. Why this holds? That again, a good exercise. It's just 2 or 3 lines at the most. Okay, so if you have L-bit output, then this is at most output size. Similarly, for privacy constraint, this is again a 2-3 line bound. Okay, you can bound this quantity by order epsilon square. Now you just plug them in. D over 20 is at most n times this whole thing. So n must be at least d square over 2 to the L epsilon square, which is exactly our upper bound from simulate and infer, d over epsilon square times d over 2 to the L. Oh, I think I jumped over time. Okay, I have 2 more minutes. Okay, because I want to just give a slightly higher level picture, and I just have 2 more good slides. Okay. In fact, this whole expression that we saw here, okay, this is actually the trace norm of a matrix. Okay, which matrix, you ask? Here is the matrix. So this HW is a d by d over 2 cross d over 2 positive semi-definite matrix, whose ijth entry is basically this quantity, okay, which tells you it's sort of the inner product of how much the channel message probabilities differ when the input is 2i minus 1 and 2i versus 2j minus 1 and 2j. So if you look at this matrix, the quantity that we obtained before is actually the trace norm of this matrix. And it turns out that all the previous things that I showed, for example, for testing the 3 bounds, this d to the 3 over 2, d, everything can be shown by in terms of just this matrix, in terms of the Frobenius norm, the trace norm, the operator norm, and so on. They will come in very different ways to give you tight bounds. Okay. So I think the last part was a little quick. So what will happen in the next 45 minutes is Himanshu is going to talk and reinforce the things that we have talked in a much from a fresh start. And this is not the reinforcement learning that will happen tomorrow. This will happen right now. So we'll, and I think he plans to do it in a much slower pace. So if there are any questions, please feel free to ask now. I have a bunch of references and